Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with my review for Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl, which I buddy read with Abby McReed back in October, I believe it was. It's been a while since I read this book. This was a very popular young adult book that came out earlier this summer, I believe. I saw a number of people talking about it, and I was very intrigued because I had another book by Marisha Pessl on my shelf that I'd picked up randomly and had never heard of her before. So I was intrigued by this and the hype it was getting, as well as the other book of hers that I own. This is a young adult science fiction thriller novel. Their senior year of high school, Beatrice's boyfriend Jim was killed, and it was one of those questionable deaths where nobody really knew what happened and they just sort of continued on because he came from a rich family that didn't want a scandal. This takes place the summer after they all come back from college, where Bea is meeting up with her 5 friends for the very first time. They go out to celebrate a birthday and wind up getting in a car accident and getting stuck in a Groundhog Day type time loop. The rest of the story follows them as they try to unravel the mystery of Jim's death, as well as trying to get out of the time loop so they can go back to living their lives. I went into this book knowing absolutely nothing because no one really said anything in the reviews that I saw of it. They all said it was good to go in completely blank, and while I do understand that to some degree, I think it's helpful to know what the story is going to be going in and not just think it's some weird undefinable thing. Going in, I expected the Neverworld Wake to be kind of a purgatory where the 5 were stuck alone and hashing out things together. And instead it's a Groundhog Day story. They're stuck in this time loop of I think 7 or 8 hours that they just keep repeating, and they wake up every day and repeat those few hours. And as soon as I realized that in the story, I was very disappointed because I don't like Groundhog Day stories. I did like Groundhog Day. I do think it's a well done movie. It's very entertaining. Who doesn't like Bill Murray? But I find Groundhog Day stories to be incredibly repetitive and incredibly dull. They're stuck in this very specific format that they've chosen to do, and as a result, they're very limited in how they can tell the story and how the characters can react to certain things and what they can actually do. So I find that the more I watch, the less I like them, which is not to say that they're poorly done. It's just a format that I can very rarely get behind. This book surprised me. I gave this 4 stars, and this is honestly one of the few books I've read recently that has really lived up to the hype for me. I thought this was fantastic. It was intriguing and full of suspense, and Abby and I were reading, I think it was 5 chapters or 50 pages a day or something like that, and I honestly never wanted to put it down. It was so hard not to just give up on the buddy read and binge read the entire book, because that's 100% what I would have done if I hadn't been buddy reading it with Abby. And I honestly think that made reading this a better experience. It made it so fun to just have to force yourself to put it down when you didn't want to, and extend the reading to almost a week, I think it took us. It was so entertaining, so much fun, and I just really enjoyed this book. For the Groundhog Day format, you realize that fairly early on. That's not a plot twist or a spoiler or anything. It's just, that's what the story is like. It's a Groundhog Day story. I was so worried that it was just gonna be a drag and that I was gonna be a bad buddy reader, because I hate buddy reading books and not liking them when the other person does, because that happens to me a lot because I am so picky. But I thought the Groundhog Day scenario was done so well in this. I've never seen a Groundhog Day story where it's centered around a group of people who were stuck in the time loop instead of just one person. And because that was so different, it felt like it opened up a lot of new avenues for the story, where usually in Groundhog Day stories, it's just the one person who's repeating the same day, and then they're repeating the same conversations and telling the same person, and it's been done in Supernatural and Death Day and a million other things that I've seen, and it gets old. But this brought something new to the table, and that was why it worked for me. There were 6 people stuck in this time loop, and it allowed for not only them going off on their own and doing their own thing, but also them working together because they remembered being in the time loop together, and it added something new that I'd never seen before. I also really enjoyed all the characters. 6 characters is a lot for a story, and it was a little bit difficult to keep up with all of them at times and to remember who each one specifically was, especially since I was reading this in smaller chunks than I usually read stories. But they were all very distinct and very interesting. And it would have been so easy for them to turn into like Breakfast Club type characters where they each have like their one thing and then it's like, oh, but they're real people too. And this, they were just really well developed and really interesting people with lots of flaws and intricate backstories, and I was really impressed by how well they were done. It takes a lot for me to get invested in 6 different characters, and I do think that there were definitely some that I remember less and some that have faded quite a bit, but I loved Martha. I was really entertained by Whitley. I loved the 2 boys who I can't think of their names right now. And Bee was just a really cool main character. She was passive enough to allow things to go on around her and to allow her friends to be sort of the louder, outspoken ones, but she was also an active participant in the story, which is a very fine line to walk, I think, and I really loved it. I do think the beginning was a little bit tough for me to get into. I wasn't sure how I felt about this book for a while, and I think that was because the ending felt really fast to me. I kind of wish it had been slowed down and sort of allowed you to experience more of the characters' first few days in the Neverworld wake, because we didn't really get much of a grasp of what it was like to sort of realize that and then live the first few days instead of just like getting into the routine very quickly of, oh, we've been here for however many years, however long, and we've just given up. I felt like that could have been slowed down a little bit more and it would have greatened my appreciation for this book. And also, because it was so fast at the beginning, it felt like there was a lot of exposition. There was a lot of explaining what the Neverworld Wake was, and if it had been slowed down, I feel like that would have meshed a lot better with the story. And it wouldn't have felt just like a big info dump at the beginning to explain what's going on, because this is kind of a weird sci-fi-esque story. I also felt like I needed more details on Jim earlier than I got them. He was such a big part of the story from the beginning. They were very concerned about Jim's death, and Bee especially was very hung up on it, which is understandable. I don't mean that as like a callous thing. Like, of course she's very concerned that her boyfriend died mysteriously a year and a half ago. But I feel like for the amount they talked about Jim, there was really not that much information available on him until like 100 pages into the book. I was very confused. I had no idea who he was as a person, or honestly how he died or what was questionable about it, because they kept saying like, oh, it was like a mysterious circumstances, or like we don't really know what happened. But I didn't understand what that meant, if it was like an accident, if it was murder, if it was suicide, like what happened. And I really felt like I needed those answers earlier in the story than I got them. One thing that kind of irritated me later in the book, which I find is fairly typical for time loop Groundhog Day stories, is Bee has infinite time to figure out her plan and like what she's doing and how to like do certain things. So she does a lot of trial and error. And because there's a lot of trial and error, it gets kind of boring to read. Like, she had explained everything she was doing in great detail. Like, oh, it takes 15 seconds for me to get from point A to point B. And then I have to wait 30 seconds for this person to walk by. And then I have to sprint to X location. And it was very dull to read. I don't need that much detail in everything that she's doing. But it's something that happens in a lot of Groundhog Day stories to kind of capture how much time the character is there. And there were sections in the middle where I was honestly skimming paragraphs just because I didn't care about all those little tiny details about what Bee was doing and like how to get from places and how much time it took. And I just felt like there was way too much of that, and it really bogged down the story for me. A small thing that really bugged me that wasn't like a major part of the story and didn't really affect my enjoyment, but it did bug me. Marisha Pessl kept using schizophrenic as an adjective. She'd say, oh, he has almost a schizophrenic way with voices, and kind of things like that. And it just really irritated me. Like, A, using a mental illness as an adjective like that is very uncomfortable. And B, she kept using it wrong. Like, I think she mixed up schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. And I think that was what she meant, because the way she was using it just seemed very wrong for schizophrenia. Just overall, that seemed like such an unnecessary, cringy addition to the story, and It happened like 3 or 4 times, like enough that it was not just once, and I was really noticing it. And that just really kind of irritated me. And my final critique, because this has been very critique filled for a 4-star book, I feel like if you're someone who's really good at predicting endings, this ending's not going to shock you. Because it kind of surprised me, but also it was kind of expected. Like, okay, yeah, that's where the story has to go. Like, I'm not wholly surprised by this. Like, I didn't guess it, but it had been one of my theories, and I'd sort of dismissed it for various reasons. And I do think if you're looking to get like super shocked by this ending and you're good at guessing endings, this isn't going to do it for you. But I think if you're not, this will like very much surprise you in the end. It was really entertaining. It was really fun. I really enjoyed this book. Like just the experience of buddy reading it with Abby was great. And I think she really enjoyed this book too. It was just one of those books that was super fun, super enjoyable, just like a great reading experience all around, and like really fun to split up and like force yourself to stop every few chapters because that really like dragged it out and made it so much more suspenseful. I do think that having had some time to sit on this book, it was not as great as the reading experience led it to be. When I had some time to reflect, and not just because it's like a month and a half after I read it or whatever, but even just like a few days after I read it, it sort of like wore a little bit thin. Like, okay, that story wasn't that great. But I'm giving it 4 stars because the reading experience was so much fun. And sometimes that's all you want. Like, you don't need a book that you look back on and think, well, that was like good, but it wasn't that great. But the reading experience and like actually reading it and being involved in the story was so great, and I would highly recommend this. I honestly don't find that many books that live up to the hype for me because I'm super picky, but this one did, and I'm so glad I picked it up, and I'm so glad I buddy read it with Abby because it was such a blast. Let me know down below if you read this book and what you thought of it if you did. I would love to talk to some more people about it because I haven't really heard that much about it since the summer, and I haven't seen that many people reading it recently. It was very hyped for a very short period of time, but then it seemed to drop off the radar, which disappoints me because I thought it was a really well done book. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon.